Lyra Cross had rehearsed the lie so many times it no longer felt like one. Housekeeper. 28 years old. 3 references, all fake, all built by a man she'd paid in cash and never seen again. She repeated it to herself in the elevator mirror on her way up to the 62nd floor, smoothing down the plain grey uniform the agency had given her, tucking a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. The penthouse doors opened into a world she used to belong to. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the East River, a kitchen bigger than the apartment she currently rented under a name that wasn't hers. Lyra kept her face still, the way she'd trained herself to over the last 2 years, and followed the household manager's instructions like she'd never touched anything finer than a mop in her life. She hadn't touched a mop in her life, actually, but she'd learned fast. She'd learned faster than that. By her 3rd hour on the job, she had the layout memorized, not because she was told to memorize it, but because memorizing rooms was a habit she couldn't switch off anymore. Camera in the east hallway, angled to miss the service stairwell by maybe 4 inches. Motion sensor by the study door, older model, the kind that could be walked past slowly enough not to trigger. And behind a bookshelf that didn't quite sit flush against the wall, a vault. She wasn't supposed to know it was there. She wasn't supposed to know what was inside it either. But her family used to own the company that built that exact vault system, back when Cross Dynasty meant something in this city, back before her name became a liability instead of a legacy. She knew the wiring. She knew the failure point. And when the household manager stepped away to take a phone call, Lyra had maybe 90 seconds and a small circuit tool sewn into the hem of her sleeve. She used 70 of them. She didn't get anything out. She wasn't there for money, and she knew better than to grab blind on a first shift. She only needed to confirm the vault was the same model, that the deeds she'd tracked here through 6 months of paperwork and 3 false starts were actually behind that door. She closed the panel, smoothed her sleeve down, and turned around to find a man standing in the doorway, watching her with the kind of stillness that made the room feel smaller. She hadn't heard him come in. That alone told her everything about who he was. "You're fast," he said. Not a question. Not even surprise, really. Just an observation, delivered the way someone might comment on the weather. 10 seconds, maybe 11. I've had professionals take longer. Lyra didn't reach for an excuse. Excuses were for people who thought they might be believed. Instead, she straightened her spine and looked at him properly for the first time. Tall, dark-haired, dressed like he'd walked out of a boardroom rather than a household, with the kind of quiet, contained energy that told her he didn't need to raise his voice to be dangerous. She'd done her research before taking this job. Dax Thorne, officially the head of a logistics and holdings company with offices in 4 states. Unofficially, the reason 3 of her father's old rivals had quietly disappeared from the city's business circles over the past decade. She'd walked into the home of a man who ran half the syndicate networks on the East Coast, and she'd done it on purpose. "I was checking a hinge," she said. "It was loose." "It's not loose." He stepped further into the room, and she noticed he didn't reach for his phone, didn't call for security, didn't do any of the things a man in his position should have done the second he found an intruder disguised as staff. He just watched her, patient, like he had all the time in the world and nowhere else he'd rather be. "That vault has been in this house longer than I have. Nobody touches it. Nobody knows the panel's even there, except, apparently, you." Lyra's pulse was steady. She'd trained it to stay steady in situations far worse than this one. But something in the way he said, "Nobody knows the panel's even there," made her chest tighten. Because it meant he'd been testing her, watching, maybe from the moment she walked in. "I should go," she said, moving toward the door. He didn't block her path. He didn't need to. "That's an interesting necklace," he said instead, and her hand went to her collar before she could stop it. The pendant. She'd forgotten about the pendant. It had slipped free of her collar sometime during the 90 seconds at the vault, and now it sat in plain view, a small engraved signet, old gold, worn smooth at the edges from being touched too many times by too many nervous fingers. It bore a crest most people in this city wouldn't recognize anymore, a falcon over crossed keys, the Cross family emblem, the one that used to sit on letterhead and boardroom doors before her family's empire collapsed into scandal and silence. Dax's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, like a lock clicking into place. "You're not a housekeeper," he said quietly. "You're a cross." Lyra felt the lie dissolve in her mouth, 2 years of careful invisibility unraveling in a single sentence. She lifted her chin instead of looking away, because whatever came next, she refused to do it while flinching. "My name is Lyra," she said, "and I think you have something of mine." Lyra hadn't expected to sleep. Security had escorted her to a guest suite the night before, and though the door wasn't locked, she knew better than to test it. She lay awake most of the night, running numbers in her head, trying to guess how much Dax already knew and how much he was only pretending to know, a trick her father used to play on rivals across a boardroom table. By morning, a car was waiting to take her downtown. Thorn Enterprise occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower she'd walked past 100 times without ever looking up. Inside, everything moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that told her this wasn't a company that needed to shout about its power. People didn't stop what they were doing when Dax walked through, but they didn't relax either. She noticed the difference immediately. Respect built on fear settles into a room in a way politeness never does. He led her into a corner office with a view that made the penthouse windows look modest, closed the door, and gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "I could have called the police last night," he said, settling behind his desk without any urgency. "I didn't. I noticed." "So talk. Convince me you're not here to rob me." Lyra had spent 6 months building toward this conversation, and now that it had arrived, she found she wanted to skip the careful version and just say it plainly. 4 years ago, my father's company was Cross Dynasty. Manufacturing, freight, land holdings going back 3 generations. When the board turned on him, they didn't just take the business. They liquidated everything fast, before anyone could ask too many questions, and sold the pieces off to whoever paid quickest. She watched his face for a reaction, and found none, which told her he already suspected where this was going. "One of those pieces came through an acquisition your company made 18 months ago. Original paper land deeds. Bearer bonds, the physical kind, the kind that can't be traced once they change hands. You didn't know what you had. I don't think anyone at your company knew what they had. And you took a job scrubbing my floors to find out." "I took a job scrubbing your floors because nobody expects the woman with the mop to be looking for anything." She said it without bitterness, though there was plenty available if she'd wanted to reach for it. "I tried the legal route first. Lawyers, records requests, all of it. Every path led to a dead end that felt less like bad luck and more like somebody paving it over." Something shifted in Dax's posture, subtle but real. He pulled a folder toward himself, though he didn't open it yet. "What would you have done if I hadn't caught you at the vault?" "Confirmed what was inside. Come back for it properly. Left before anyone noticed I'd been there at all." "That's not an answer that makes me trust you." "I didn't come here for your trust. I came here for what's mine." For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them felt less like a standoff and more like 2 people quietly recalculating each other. Lyra had expected anger, or at least suspicion sharp enough to cut. What she got instead was a man studying her the way he might study a business problem he hadn't solved yet, weighing pieces, looking for the shape underneath. Before he could respond, the office door opened without a knock. A woman in her 30s stepped in, tablet in hand, expression tight in a way that made Dax straighten immediately. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing once at Lyra before deciding whatever she had to say couldn't wait. "You need to see this." Dax waved her forward. She set the tablet on his desk and turned the screen toward him. Lyra couldn't see the details from where she stood, but she saw the columns, the kind of transaction ledger she'd once read for a living. "Someone flagged a series of quiet inquiries on the old Cross Dynasty holdings," the analyst said. "Land parcels, the bearer bonds in the vault, all of it. Buyers have been sniffing around for weeks. and whoever's fielding the offers has internal access. This isn't an outside leak, it's coming from inside the firm. Lyra felt the floor tilt slightly under her, though she kept her face composed out of long habit. Someone inside Dax's own company was trying to sell off the exact assets she'd spent 6 months chasing, quietly enough that even Dax hadn't noticed until now. Dax's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something close to real anger surface, controlled but unmistakable.
How long has this been happening? 3 weeks, best guess. Whoever's doing it knows how to stay under the reporting thresholds.
Find out who. The analyst nodded and left, and the door clicked shut behind her, leaving the two of them alone again, with the air in the room noticeably different than it had been a minute earlier. Dax looked at Lyra for a long moment, and this time there was no accusation in it. "It seems," he said slowly, "we might have the same problem." Lyra felt something she hadn't expected to feel toward the man whose vault she'd tried to crack less than 24 hours earlier. Not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might grow into it, if they both survived long enough to find out who was selling her family's history out from under both of them. "Then I suggest," she said, "we find him before he finds a buyer." The gallery sat in a converted warehouse near the water, the kind of place that only advertised its auctions to people who already knew it existed. Lyra had been to a dozen rooms like it growing up, trailing behind her father while he traded pleasantries with men who'd later vote to strip him of everything he owned. She knew the rhythm of these evenings better than she knew most things. Dax had explained the plan on the drive over. His analyst had traced the quiet buyer inquiries to a broker who moved through exactly this kind of circuit. Private sales dressed up as art auctions, deals settled over champagne instead of paperwork. If someone inside Thorn Enterprise was funneling the cross assets out, this broker was the most likely point of contact. "You know this world," Dax had said.
"Better than my people do."
"I was raised in it." Now, standing in a room full of soft lighting and quieter money, Lyra understood why he'd wanted her there instead of one of his own men. She wore a dress borrowed from someone on his staff, dark green, simple enough not to draw attention, but well cut enough that she didn't look out of place among the gallery's usual crowd. Dax stayed a careful distance away, close enough to watch, far enough that nobody would connect them as a pair. She found the gallery owner near a sculpture display, a thin, watchful man named Elias Bram, who greeted every guest by name and forgot none of their preferences. Lyra had researched him the night before. He didn't just sell art, he facilitated things, quietly, for people who paid well and asked no questions. "I don't believe we've met," he said, extending a hand. "We haven't. A friend of my father's used to speak highly of you." She let the sentence hang there, vague enough to mean nothing and everything, and watched him recalibrate his interest in her accordingly. They talked for a while about nothing that mattered, and Lyra let the conversation drift the way she'd been taught, never pushing, always waiting for the other person to hand her the opening. It came 20 minutes in, when Bram mentioned almost carelessly that he had a client interested in historical land documents, the paper kind, hard to find and harder to authenticate. "Sounds like a niche market," Lyra said. "You'd be surprised how many people still want paper in a digital world, harder to trace, easier to move." He smiled like he'd said something clever instead of something dangerous. "The current seller's been very particular, wants a fast, quiet close, no auction house paperwork. Do you know who's selling?" Bram's smile thinned, the first sign she'd pushed a fraction too far. "That's not really how this works." She backed off immediately, complimented a painting she didn't care about, and let the conversation wander somewhere safer. But she'd gotten enough. A fast, quiet close meant someone nervous, someone who wanted the assets gone before anyone came looking, and that matched everything Dax's analyst had described. Across the room, she caught Dax's eye for half a second and gave the smallest nod. He excused himself from the small group he'd been standing with and disappeared toward the gallery's private office wing, the kind of move that would have looked suspicious from anyone else, but somehow looked natural coming from him. Lyra kept Bram occupied a while longer, asking about upcoming pieces, letting him enjoy the sound of his own expertise. until Dax reappeared at her side without announcing how he'd gotten back into the main room. "We need to go," he said quietly, once they were out of earshot. In the car, he told her what he'd found. Bram's office computer, unlocked and unattended for the few minutes it took his assistant to fetch drinks, had shown a single open email thread. The seller's account wasn't anonymous the way it was supposed to be. A signature line had slipped through in one message, the kind of mistake made by someone rushing, someone who hadn't expected anybody to be looking. Victor Hale, senior partner, one of the 3 people at Thorn Enterprise with clearance to know the vault's contents at all. Lyra felt the name land somewhere it shouldn't have, a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because they finally had a direction. Unease because Dax's face had gone very still in the way she was starting to recognize as dangerous. "You trusted him," she said. It wasn't a question. "I built half this company with him." Dax's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it now, something that hadn't been there the day before. "He's known about those assets since the acquisition went through. He's the one who told me not to worry about the paperwork in that vault, said it wasn't worth the legal cost to sort through. So he's been sitting on it, waiting. Waiting for the right buyer, someone who wouldn't ask why a senior partner had access to assets that weren't supposed to exist on our books at all." Lyra looked out the window at the water sliding past, the gallery lights shrinking behind them, and thought about how close she'd come to losing everything to a man neither of them had suspected. She'd expected outside enemies. She hadn't expected her family's legacy to be sitting inside the walls of the very company that had absorbed it, guarded by someone Dax had trusted for years. "He'll know we're looking now," she said. "Bram will tell him someone was asking questions." Dax's jaw tightened. Then we stopped being quiet about it. By morning, Dax had shut down access to 2 floors of his own building. He didn't explain the decision to his staff beyond a short memo about system maintenance, but Lyra understood what it really meant. If Victor had been careful enough to hide inside Thorn Enterprise for weeks without detection, then the Manhattan offices weren't safe for anything they needed to say out loud. Every hallway had ears that used to belong to him. The car took them across the river instead, to a squat brick building on a Jersey City pier that Dax's company used for shipping logistics rather than boardroom meetings. It smelled faintly of salt and diesel, nothing like the glass tower they'd left behind, and Lyra found she liked it better for exactly that reason. Fewer places for someone to hide a listening device. Fewer eyes that might report back to the wrong person. "Nobody outside my logistics team knows this office exists," Dax said, locking the door behind them. "Victor's never set foot here." "How can you be sure?" "Because I never told him it mattered." She almost smiled at that. There was something satisfying about watching a man rebuild his own defenses in real time, learning that trust wasn't a fixed thing, but something that had to be re-earned room by room, now that one of his closest partners had been quietly hollowing it out. They spread the little evidence they had across a battered metal desk. The email fragment from Bram's office, a printout of the acquisition paperwork from 18 months ago, the one that listed the cross-dynasty holdings as an unspecified miscellaneous asset bundle, buried deep enough in the appendix that nobody without a reason to look would ever have found it. Lyra had found it. She'd spent 4 months combing through public filings before she even knew Dax's name. "Tell me how it happened," Dax said, watching her across the desk. "The company, your father, all of it." Lyra hadn't told the full story to anyone in 2 years. She kept most of it locked somewhere she didn't visit often, because visiting it cost her more than she liked to admit. But something about the quiet of the pier office, the absence of anyone who might use it against her later, made it easier to let the words out. "I was overseas when it happened. A supplier trip, 3 weeks, nothing unusual." She kept her eyes on the papers instead of on him. "By the time I landed back home, the board had already voted my father out. They called it a financial irregularity, said he'd been mismanaging funds for years. It wasn't true. Someone had been altering the books, slowly, patiently, for months before I ever left the country, building a case against him piece by piece so it would look airtight the moment they needed it to." "Who?" "I never found out for certain. By the time I started asking, the company had already been sold off in pieces to cover the supposed debts. My father had a stroke 2 months later. He never fully recovered his speech. She paused, steadying herself the way she'd trained to. I went underground after that, changed my name for work, kept my head down, because whoever engineered it made it very clear, in small, quiet ways, that I'd be safer disappearing than digging. Dax was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the sharp, controlled edge she'd heard from him since the first night. That's not a coincidence. A slow accounting fraud, patient enough to survive an audit, timed to hit while the one person likely to notice was out of the country. He looked at her carefully. That takes someone with access, someone who knew your schedule. The thought settled over her slowly, uncomfortably, like a door she hadn't wanted to open, creaking wider on its own. She'd spent 2 years assuming the betrayal had come purely from her father's board, faceless men in a room she'd never sat in. She hadn't let herself consider that it might have required help from somewhere closer, somewhere inside her own circle. You think Victor was involved in the original collapse, not just the recent sale? I think it's worth finding out. Dax pulled the acquisition paperwork closer, running a finger down the timeline. The cross-dynasty holdings didn't just wander into my company by accident. Someone steered that acquisition our way, made sure it looked routine enough that nobody would double-check what was actually inside it. Lyra felt the ground shift under a story she'd told herself so many times it had calcified into fact. 2 years of blaming a nameless board, and now the shape of something far more deliberate was starting to emerge, something that stretched back further than she'd ever let herself imagine. "There's a ledger," she said slowly, the memory surfacing almost against her will. "My family kept physical records at our old estate upstate, separate from the digital books, an old habit from my grandfather's time. If someone altered the company's official accounts, the paper ledger might still show the truth underneath it." Dax looked at her, something steady and certain settling into his expression. "Then that's where we go next." The estate hadn't been touched in 2 years, and it showed the moment they turned up the long gravel drive. Ivy had crept across the lower windows. The iron gate stood half open, rusted into position, as if the house itself had given up expecting anyone to come back through it. Lyra hadn't been back since the collapse. She'd avoided it deliberately, telling herself there was no reason to return to a place full of rooms she couldn't afford to maintain and memories she wasn't ready to sit with. Standing at the front steps now, key trembling slightly in her hand, she understood it had never really been about the cost. "You don't have to do this today," Dax said quietly beside her. "Yes, I do." She turned the key. The lock, at least, still worked. Inside, dust sheets covered most of the furniture, pale shapes in a dim hallway that smelled of old wood and disuse. Lyra moved through it, slowly, memory guiding her more than sight. Past the drawing room where her father used to host dinners, past the staircase until a housekeeper caught her doing it. Dax followed a respectful step behind, not rushing her, letting her set the pace through a house that clearly held more weight for her than either of them had said out loud. The archive room sat at the back of the estate, behind a locked study door that took 3 tries with the old key before it finally gave. Inside, floor-to-ceiling shelves held decades of paper records, ledgers, correspondence, contracts going back to her grandfather's founding of the company. It would have taken weeks to search properly if Lyra hadn't known exactly where to look. "My grandfather kept a duplicate set," she explained, pulling a heavy leather-bound volume from a shelf near the back. "He never trusted digital records, even after the company modernized everything else. Said paper couldn't be hacked, only stolen, and stealing left evidence." She set the ledger on the reading table and began turning pages carefully, years of entries in careful, old-fashioned handwriting that had transitioned, somewhere around 8 years back, to a different hand entirely. Lyra's finger stopped on the page. "This isn't my father's writing." Dax leaned in. "Whose is it?" She stared at the entry for a long moment, something cold settling in her chest as the pieces started sliding into place. The handwriting belonged to her father's longtime accountant, a man named Reeves, who'd worked for the family for over a decade, and had quietly resigned 2 months after the collapse, citing health reasons nobody had thought to question at the time. "He was falsifying entries," she said slowly. "Small ones at first. Look, here, a shipment valuation that doesn't match the original manifest. And here again, 3 months later, bigger this time. Building toward something. Building toward exactly what happened." Lyra flipped forward, faster now, watching the pattern repeat itself across a dozen more entries, each one shaving value away from the company in ways too small to trigger an audit on their own, but large enough, compounded over years, to manufacture the appearance of the financial collapse the board had used to justify seizing control. He wasn't acting alone. Someone had to be receiving the difference. Someone had to know exactly when I'd be out of the country so the timing would work. Dax was quiet, reading over her shoulder, and she felt him go very still beside her. "Reeves worked for your father for years. People like that don't turn on their own without a reason. Money, or leverage." Lyra kept turning pages, and near the final falsified entry, tucked into the margin, in the same altered handwriting, she found a set of initials she hadn't expected. V.H. She sat back slowly, the weight of it settling over her all at once. Victor Hale hadn't simply discovered the cross-dynasty assets after they landed inside Thorn Enterprise by chance. He'd been involved from the very beginning, reaching into her family's collapse years before Dax's company ever acquired the pieces of what was left. "He's the one who steered it toward you," she said quietly, looking up at Dax. "Not luck, not a routine acquisition. He built the collapse and then made sure the wreckage landed somewhere he could still control it." Dax's expression had hardened into something Lyra hadn't seen from him before. Quiet and absolute. "He used my company to finish what he started years ago." They sat together at the reading table for a long moment, the ledger open between them, the house silent around them in a way that felt less empty now, and more like it was finally being heard. Lyra hadn't expected to feel anything toward Dax beyond cautious alliance, two people using each other to solve separate problems that happened to overlap. But watching him absorb the full shape of Victor's betrayal alongside her, taking it as seriously as if it were his own family's history and not just hers, she felt something shift, quiet and unspoken, settling into place beside the anger. "We have what we need," Dax said finally, closing the ledger with careful hands. "Now we just have to get it somewhere safe before he realizes it exists." They left the estate before dawn, the ledger wrapped in a canvas bag and tucked against Lyra's side, the entire drive back down to the city. Dax had made the decision overnight. Manhattan wasn't safe to hold it, not with Victor's reach inside the company, and Rhode Island was too far to drive without risking a stop somewhere exposed. The train offered something a car couldn't. Crowds, witnesses, a schedule Victor's people would have to guess at rather than track. It hadn't stayed a secret for long. Lyra spotted them first, 2 stops after Penn Station, in the reflection of the train window rather than looking at them directly, a habit she'd carried since the day she went underground. 2 men, seated separately, both a little too still for people supposedly reading or working. One kept glancing toward their car every few minutes, with the practiced casualness of someone who'd been told not to look obvious and hadn't quite managed it. "We have company," she said quietly, not turning her head. Dax didn't react visibly, which told her he'd probably clocked them already. Corporate fixers, Victors most likely, not the kind who'd risk anything messy in public. He'll want the ledger back quietly, before anyone realizes it exists at all. Then we don't let them get close enough to try. The train rolled on through Connecticut, and Lyra used the time the way she'd used every quiet hour of the last 2 years, thinking 3 steps ahead instead of reacting to whatever was directly in front of her. She excused herself toward the cafe car, watched from the corner of her eye as one of the men shifted in his seat, deciding whether to follow. He didn't, not yet, which told her they were waiting for a better opportunity, somewhere with fewer people around. She returned with 2 coffees and a plan. "There's a baggage car 2 cars back," she said, sliding into the seat beside Dax and speaking low enough that the words wouldn't carry. "Employees only, But the lock's an older model, the kind conductors leave loose during a route this short. If we can get both of them into it at the same time, we buy ourselves enough distance to be gone before anyone realizes they're stuck. Both of them, at once. They won't split up voluntarily, which means we give them a reason to think splitting up is a mistake. The plan came together in pieces over the next 20 minutes, small enough details that Lyra kept revising as she watched the two men settle into their rhythm. She waited until the train crossed into a stretch with a scheduled slowdown near a junction, timing she'd noticed on a printed schedule tucked into the seat pocket, and made her move. She stood, letting her canvas bag catch visibly on the armrest as she passed, drawing exactly the kind of attention she wanted. One of the men rose immediately, following at a careful distance as she moved toward the rear of the train. Dax gave it 30 seconds before rising himself, moving in the opposite direction toward the front, drawing the second man's attention away from his partner entirely. Lyra ducked into the baggage car exactly as planned, empty except for stacked luggage and the low hum of the train's wheels beneath her feet. She heard the man's footsteps behind her, hesitant at the threshold, the kind of hesitation that came from being told to avoid a scene rather than confidence about what waited inside. She pressed herself against the shadow of a luggage rack and waited. He stepped in. She slipped past him toward the door the moment his back was turned, sliding the old latch shut from outside before he'd fully registered she'd moved at all. His voice rose in protest a beat too late, muffled now behind heavy metal. Across the train, she found Dax already waiting near the connecting doors, his own pursuer nowhere in sight. "Storage closet by the front vestibule," he said simply. Told him I'd seen someone matching his description going through passenger bags. He couldn't resist checking. They didn't stay to see how long it took either man to talk their way free. At the next station, a small stop neither of them had planned to use, they stepped off quietly among a crowd of commuters and let the train pull away without them, the two fixers still locked in place somewhere behind, discovering slowly that their quarry had never intended to make it all the way to Boston in the first place. Standing on the platform in the cooling evening air, Lyra felt something unfamiliar settle over her, adrenaline easing into something quieter. She'd spent 2 years running alone, always assuming the safest path meant trusting no one, relying on nothing but her own careful planning. Watching Dax fall into step beside her strategy without hesitation, matching her timing without needing it explained twice, she realized she hadn't had to do any of it by herself this time. "You're good at this," she said, glancing at him as they crossed toward the small station's exit. "So are you." He looked at her, something warmer than strategy in his expression now. Better than good, actually. They found a car waiting to take them the rest of the way toward the coast, the ledger still safe between them, Victor's men still locked somewhere behind on a train heading in the wrong direction entirely. The villa belonged to one of Dax's shipping partners, a quiet property tucked behind a hedge of overgrown rosemary, with a view of the water that made it feel further from the city than it actually was. Dax had used it before for business he didn't want traced back to an address anyone could look up. Nobody outside a handful of trusted people knew it existed. They spent the first day simply recovering. Lyra hadn't realized how much the last week had cost her until she woke on the second morning without the familiar tightness in her chest that had lived there for 2 years straight. It didn't disappear entirely, but for the first time since she'd taken the maid job, she let herself believe there was a version of this story where she came out the other side of it whole. By the third day, they were back at work, the ledger spread across a long wooden table alongside printouts Dax's analyst had quietly compiled and sent through an encrypted channel, current corporate registries showing exactly how the cross-dynasty assets had moved through Thorne Enterprises' books over the past 18 months. "Cross-reference the falsified entries against the acquisition paperwork," Lyra said, sliding the ledger toward him. "If Reeves and Victor built this together, the numbers should line up on both ends. What Reeves stole from my father's books should match what quietly appeared in Victor's acquisition filing." They worked through the afternoon in a rhythm that surprised her with how comfortable it felt. Passing pages back and forth, cross-checking dates, building a timeline neither of them said out loud they were both starting to trust completely. The numbers matched almost perfectly. Every falsified entry in her grandfather's ledger corresponded to an asset that had resurfaced, quietly repackaged, inside Thorn Enterprises' acquisition filing exactly 18 months later. It was Lyra who found the clause, buried in the appendix of the acquisition paperwork, in language dense enough that she suspected it had been written deliberately to discourage anyone from reading closely, sat a provision granting the acquiring party full discretionary control over any assets deemed unclaimed or unverified at the time of transfer. On its own, it looked like standard legal boilerplate. Next to the falsified ledger entries, it looked like the final piece of the mechanism Victor had built. "He didn't just steer the assets here," she said slowly, reading the clause twice to be certain she understood it correctly. "He wrote himself a legal escape hatch before he ever moved them. If anyone questioned the acquisition, he had language ready that let him claim the cross-holdings were unverified, meaning he could sell them off individually without needing your board's approval at all." Dax read the clause over her shoulder, his jaw tightening in the way she'd come to recognize as controlled fury rather than surprise. That's not something you accidentally include in an acquisition filing. That's planned. He knew from the start he'd want a way to liquidate it quietly, without anyone above him signing off. Which means it's also evidence. Lyra felt something steady settle into her chest, the particular calm that came from finally having leverage instead of just suspicion. If we can show this clause was inserted specifically to enable an unauthorized sale, and pair it with the falsified ledger proving where the assets originally came from, it doesn't just clear my family's name. It exposes exactly what he's been building toward for years. Dax was quiet for a moment, studying her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something that had nothing to do with strategy or Victor at all. "You know," he said finally, "when I found you at that vault, I thought I was dealing with a very good thief." "You were, briefly." "I don't think that anymore." He said it simply, without the careful distance he'd kept between them since the first night. "I think I'm looking at someone who spent 2 years surviving something most people wouldn't have gotten out of bed for, and did it without losing whatever made her willing to walk back into the exact kind of danger that took everything from her in the first place." Lyra felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for longer than she could remember. Longer than the 2 years since her father's stroke, maybe longer than that even. She hadn't let herself be seen clearly by anyone in a long time, not really, not past the careful version of herself she presented to keep people at a safe distance. "I wasn't sure I'd get here," she admitted quietly. "Some nights I wasn't sure there was a here to get to." "You're here now." Dax reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that the space between them felt deliberate rather than accidental. "And you're not finishing this alone anymore, whatever happens next." Outside, the evening light was settling gold over the water, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lyra let herself believe that the ending waiting for her at the end of all this might actually be a good one. They had the ledger, they had the clause. Tomorrow, they would take both of them to Boston, where Victor was preparing to close his sale in front of an audience powerful enough that no forgery, no matter how carefully built, would survive being seen in the light. The investor summit filled 3 floors of the hotel, a rotating crowd of corporate executives, private equity partners, and the kind of quiet money that never appeared in headlines but decided who did. Victor had booked a private session in the ballroom's east wing for the final hour of the evening, invitation only, the sort of closing meeting where deals got signed over handshakes instead of hearings. Dax hadn't been invited. Getting in required a different approach than the gallery had. Lyra spent the afternoon studying the guest list Dax's analyst had managed to pull, cross-referencing names against people her family used to know, looking for a door that wouldn't require force to open. She found one in a shipping magnate named Corrigan, an old acquaintance of her father's who'd always liked Lyra and had spent the last 2 years believing she'd simply moved abroad after the Cross dynasty collapse. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, approaching him near the champagne table with the same careful poise she'd used on Bram at the gallery. "I don't know if you remember me." He didn't, not at first. Then recognition arrived slowly, followed by something like shock. followed by a warmth that told her he genuinely missed the family, rather than simply tolerated them out of business obligation. He agreed to bring her in as his guest, without asking too many questions, and Dax slipped through a service entrance 20 minutes later, using a contact from his logistics team who'd worked hotel security in Boston for years. Inside, the East Wing session had already begun. Victor stood at the head of a long table, composed and confident in a way that made Lyra's stomach tighten, presenting a polished summary of the cross-dynasty holdings to a dozen investors who had no idea the assets in front of them had been stolen twice over, first from her father and then quietly again from Dax's own company. "These parcels represent a rare opportunity," Victor was saying, gesturing at a screen displaying land maps that used to belong to her grandfather. "Clean title, verified through standard acquisition channels, ready for immediate transfer." Lyra stepped through the doorway before anyone could stop her, Dax half a pace behind, and the room's attention shifted all at once. "Those parcels aren't clean," she said, her voice carrying further than she expected in the sudden quiet. "And the title isn't verified, it's forged." Victor's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second before he recovered it, a practiced smile sliding back into place. "I'm sorry, I don't believe you were invited to this session." "I don't need an invitation to talk about my own family's land." Lyra crossed the room, setting the leather ledger down on the table in front of the assembled investors, open to the page where Reeves's altered handwriting sat plainly beside the original entries her father had kept. "This is the original cross-dynasty ledger, maintained separately from the digital books my family's accountant was falsifying, on Victor's instruction, starting 8 years ago." Murmurs moved through the room, the kind of low, uncertain sound that told her people were recalculating whether they wanted to be associated with whatever was about to unfold. Victor's voice sharpened. "This is absurd. A stolen document from a family whose company collapsed under mismanagement, presented by someone who took a job cleaning your floors to find proof of exactly what you did." Dax cut in, stepping forward beside her, his presence in the room settling something into place that hadn't been there a moment before. "I've read the acquisition filing you wrote yourself, Victor. The clause granting unilateral discretion over unverified assets. You built that language specifically to give yourself a way to liquidate the cross-holdings without my approval, the same way you built the falsified ledger entries 8 years ago to force them out of cross-family hands in the first place. You don't have proof of any of that." "I have a ledger with your initials in the margin," Lyra said quietly, turning the page for the room to see. "And I have a legal clause that only makes sense if someone always intended to sell these assets quietly, without oversight, exactly the way you're trying to do tonight." The room had gone fully silent now, every investor at the table studying the ledger, studying Victor's face, drawing their own conclusions faster than he could manage them. Corrigan, standing near the back, had gone very still, his earlier warmth toward Lyra hardening into something colder, directed entirely at Victor. "This deal is finished," one of the investors said, closing a folder in front of him with a decisive snap. "I'm not putting my firm's name on assets with a forgery question attached." Others followed within seconds, chairs sliding back, phones coming out, the careful architecture of Victor's closing session collapsing in real time under the weight of a single leather ledger and 2 people he'd badly underestimated. Victor's face had lost all its earlier composure, something desperate and cornered surfacing underneath it now. "Dax," he said, lowering his voice, trying one last time for the tone of an old partner rather than a man caught in the act. "We built this company together. Whatever you think happened here—" "I know exactly what happened," Dax said, and there was nothing left in his voice that resembled the years of trust Victor had spent building and quietly betraying. "You have until tomorrow morning before I make sure every board member and investor in this room knows precisely what you did." Victor didn't answer. He didn't need to. The room was already emptying around him, the deal dead, the truth finally standing in the open where it couldn't be steered or buried again. By the time they got back to New York, Victor had already made his first mistake. Dax's legal team caught it within hours of landing. A series of transfer requests filed overnight, quiet attempts to move whatever liquid assets Victor could still access before word of the Boston collapse spread further through the company. It wasn't subtle, not compared to the patience he'd shown over the past 8 years, and Lyra understood immediately what it meant. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He was cornered, and cornered men made mistakes that patient men never would. "That works in our favor," Dax said, reading the transfer log over his lawyer's shoulder in a conference room that had been converted into something closer to a war room overnight. "It shows intent. A man confident in his innocence doesn't try to move money the moment he's accused." The legal team moved fast once they had the ledger and the acquisition clause in hand, faster than Lyra had expected, given how slowly everything else about corporate law had always seemed to move whenever her father's lawyers tried to fight the original collapse years earlier. She realized, watching them work, that the difference wasn't the law itself. It was resources. Her father had fought this battle alone, underfunded, against a board that controlled the narrative from the start. Dax had an entire firm behind him, plus the specific kind of leverage that came from powerful investors who'd watched Victor's credibility die in real time in a Boston ballroom. They filed for an emergency injunction the following morning, federal court, a request to freeze Victor's access to any remaining cross-dynasty assets and any Thorn Enterprise accounts he could reach before the matter was properly investigated. Lyra sat beside Dax in the gallery, the ledger secured now in a sealed evidence folder rather than her canvas bag, and watched a version of justice move through a room that had failed her family completely the first time around. Victor arrived with his own lawyer, visibly thinner than he'd looked in Boston, the confidence that had carried him through years of careful theft finally cracking under the weight of evidence he couldn't explain away. He didn't look at Lyra when he came in. He looked at Dax, and something passed between them that Lyra recognized without needing it explained. The particular grief of watching a friendship curdle into something that could only end in a courtroom. The judge moved through the filing efficiently, both sides given their allotted time. Dax's legal team laid out the timeline plainly. The falsified ledger entries beginning 8 years earlier, the initials matching Victor's signature on internal documents, the specifically worded acquisition clause that made sense only if someone had planned from the start to liquidate the cross-holdings without oversight. And finally, the overnight transfer attempts that suggested a man trying to move money before an investigation could catch him. Victor's lawyer argued the ledger's authenticity, argued the initials proved nothing definitive on their own, argued that a company acquisition 18 months old shouldn't be unwound over documents that predated it by years. It was a reasonable argument, delivered by a competent lawyer, and for a moment, Lyra felt the old fear rise in her chest. The fear that had haunted every legal attempt she'd made over the past 2 years. The fear that reasonable arguments always won, regardless of what was actually true. Then the judge asked a single question that changed the shape of the room. Why had Victor attempted to transfer assets overnight, immediately following accusations he claimed were baseless? Victor's lawyer had no good answer. There wasn't one to give. The injunction was granted within the hour. Victor was formally suspended from his position, pending a full internal and possibly criminal investigation, his access to company accounts frozen, his authority over any Thorn Enterprise holdings stripped effective immediately. He was escorted out of the courtroom by his own lawyer rather than security, a small mercy Dax had apparently arranged in advance, though Lyra suspected it had less to do with mercy and more to do with avoiding a public spectacle that might complicate the ongoing investigation. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the thin autumn light, Lyra felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 2 years settle over her. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and steadier than that. Vindication, maybe. The particular relief of watching the truth finally hold weight in a room built to weigh it. "It's not over," Dax said beside her, watching Victor's car pull away from the curb. "The investigation will take months. There'll be more filings, more hearings." "I know." Lyra looked at the ledger folder in her hands, the same worn leather that had sat untouched on a dusty shelf for 2 years before she'd carried it across 3 states to bring them here. "But it's finally moving in the right direction. That's more than I've had in a long time." Dax turned to look at her properly, something warm settling into his expression that had nothing to do with courtrooms or acquisitions or any of the careful strategy that had brought them this far. "You did this," he said quietly. "Not the ledger, not the clause. You. You walked into my house pretending to be someone you weren't and ended up being more honest with me than almost anyone I've worked with in years." Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, unexpected and unfamiliar after everything else that had happened over the past week. "I had good reason to lie to you at the start." "I know." He held her gaze, steady. "I'm glad you stopped." They stood together on the courthouse steps a moment longer, the city moving around them, the worst of the fight finally behind them, and something new, uncertain but promising, opening up in front of them instead. Dax's message that morning had been short. "Meet me at the harbor terminal at noon. There's something I need to hand you in person." Lyra had read it 3 times over coffee, trying to guess what could possibly require a shipping dock instead of an office, and came up with nothing that made sense until the car dropped her at the gate and she saw the extent of what he'd actually organized. The main terminal building sat at the edge of the water, cranes idle overhead, the smell of salt and metal thick in the cold morning air. Dax was waiting near the loading office, and beside him stood a small group she recognized from the past 2 weeks, his head analyst, one of the lawyers from the injunction hearing, and, unexpectedly, Corrigan, the old family acquaintance from the Boston summit, looking pleased with himself in a way that told her he'd had some hand in whatever was about to happen. "You didn't have to bring an audience," she said, half joking as she approached. "I wanted witnesses," Dax said, "for something official." He led her into the loading office, where a table had been cleared and set with a single folder, thick and formally bound in a way that made her chest tighten before she'd even opened it. Dax gestured for her to sit, and when she did, he remained standing, hands in his pockets, something almost nervous in the set of his shoulders that she hadn't seen from him before, not even in the courtroom. "The injunction froze Victor's access," he said, "but it didn't automatically return anything to you. Legally, until an internal review confirms it, all of it, the land deeds, the bearer bonds, everything in that vault, technically still sits on Thorn Enterprises' books." "I know." She'd made peace with that reality over the past 2 days, telling herself the fight for legal recognition would take months, maybe longer, and that she'd have to be patient, the way she'd learned to be patient about everything else. "I didn't want to wait for the review." Dax opened the folder himself and turned it toward her. "This is a full transfer of ownership. Every deed, every bond, everything that came out of that vault, signed back to you, effective today, independent of whatever the internal investigation eventually concludes." Lyra stared at the paperwork, her own family's crest printed clean and official at the top of the transfer document, her name listed as sole recipient. "You can't do this. If the investigation finds any of it was improperly handled during the acquisition." "Then I'll deal with that when it happens. I'm not waiting on paperwork to do the right thing, not after everything you went through to get here." He crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level, something quiet and certain in his voice. "You spent 2 years fighting to get this back, through every legal channel that failed you. I'm not going to be another one of those channels, dragging my feet behind lawyers and internal reviews while you wait for permission to have back what was always yours." She looked up at him, throat tight, and understood in that moment that this wasn't only about the deeds. It was about the 2 years before she'd ever walked into his penthouse, all the doors that had closed on her, all the careful, patient people who'd told her the process simply took time, while Victor quietly finished dismantling what remained of her family's name. Dax was choosing, deliberately, not to be one more version of that same slow betrayal. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You didn't owe me this. Legally, you didn't owe me anything until the investigation cleared it." "Because somewhere between the vault and that Boston ballroom, I stopped thinking of this as a legal problem." Dax's voice had gone low, steady, entirely without the careful distance he'd kept between them the first night they met. "I started thinking of it as your family's legacy, sitting in my company's holdings because of what Victor did to you. And I couldn't sit across from you every day, knowing I had the power to fix that immediately, and chose to wait for permission instead." Lyra signed the transfer with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, watched Corrigan and the lawyer countersign as witnesses, felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 2 long years. When it was done, Dax closed the folder gently and set it aside. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. The harbour sounds outside filling the quiet, gulls and machinery and the distant horn of a departing ship. "There's one more thing," Dax said finally. "There's more?" "Not paperwork." He held her gaze, and something in his expression made her chest tighten in an entirely different way than the transfer folder had. "When this started, you told me you came for what was yours. You got it. But I'd like to know if there's a version of this where you don't disappear the moment you have it back, where whatever this is between us gets to keep going instead of ending here." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, the harbour light catching grey in his eyes, and felt the careful, guarded version of herself she'd built over 2 years quietly loosen its grip. "I wasn't planning on disappearing," she said softly. "Not this time." The gate no longer hung half open when Lyra arrived. She'd hired a crew 2 days earlier, the first real money she'd spent since reclaiming the deeds, and they'd worked fast, clearing the ivy from the lower windows, oiling the old hinges until the iron swung smooth again. It wasn't fully restored, not yet, but it looked like a house someone intended to live in again, instead of one waiting quietly to be forgotten. Dax met her at the top of the drive, having driven up separately after a morning of calls with his legal team. The investigation into Victor was still ongoing, criminal charges likely to follow the internal review, but none of it touched the transfer he'd signed over at the harbour 2 days earlier. That part was settled, clean, hers. "It looks different," he said, studying the cleared windows, the gate standing fully open for what she guessed was the first time in over 2 years. "It looks like it used to." Lyra stood at the base of the steps a moment, letting the feeling settle rather than rushing past it the way she'd rushed past so much over the last 2 years just to keep moving. "I used to think I'd never come back here except to pack up what was left and sell it. And now? Now I think I want to actually live in it." They walked through together, room by room, the dust sheets already gone from the ground floor, sunlight falling clean through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Lyra found herself narrating without meaning to, the drawing room where her father hosted dinners, the staircase she used to slide down, small pieces of a life she'd locked away because looking at them too long used to hurt more than she could afford. It didn't hurt the same way now. It felt instead like she was finally allowed to remember it properly, without the weight of loss pressing every memory flat. In the archive room, the ledger sat back on its shelf where it belonged, though a copy now lived permanently in a lawyer's vault as evidence for the ongoing case. Lyra ran a hand along the spine of it, thinking about how close she'd come to never finding it at all, how differently this could have ended if Dax had reacted the way most people in his position would have that first night. Security called, police summoned, the story over before it properly began. "I keep thinking about the vault," she admitted, turning to find him watching her from the doorway. "If you'd caught me and just handed me over to security, none of this happens. Victor keeps selling pieces of my family off quietly for years. I never find out the truth about Reeves, about how far back it actually went." "I thought about calling security," Dax said, "for about 4 seconds. What stopped you?" "You didn't look like someone stealing for herself. You looked like someone with a reason good enough to risk everything on 10 seconds at a vault panel." He crossed the room, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze. "I've spent years around people who take things because they want more than they have. You weren't that. I could see it even before I understood why." Lyra felt the last guarded corner of herself finally settle. 2 years of careful distance from everyone she'd met, dissolving into something she hadn't let herself want in a long time. "I came here to get my family's legacy back," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to find someone willing to fight for it alongside me, instead of just handing it over and stepping away." "I'm not interested in stepping away." Dax reached for her hand, unhurried, certain in a way that matched everything she'd come to know about him over the past 2 weeks.
I told you at the harbour, I don't want this to end just because the deeds are signed. I meant it. They walked out to the back terrace as the afternoon light softened toward evening, the grounds still overgrown but no longer abandoned, the first real work of bringing the estate back to life visible in cleared paths and freshly opened shutters. Lyra thought about the woman who'd walked up this same drive 2 weeks ago in a borrowed housekeeper's uniform, certain she'd have to do all of it alone, certain that trusting anyone, especially a man with Dax's reputation, was a risk she couldn't afford to take. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the company? With everything Victor built and Reeves helped hide?" "The investigation finishes. Victor answers for what he did, to your family and to mine." Dax turned to face her fully, something steady and hopeful in his expression that had nothing to do with strategy anymore. "And the cross-dynasty holdings, all of it. Stop being something Thorn Enterprise absorbed by accident. I want to build something new with you, if you'll have it. Not me holding your family's legacy for you, both of us, together, equal partners, the way it should have stayed all along." Lyra looked out over the grounds, her grandfather's estate finally waking up after 2 long years of silence, and thought about how far she'd come from the woman who'd rehearsed a lie in an elevator mirror, certain that survival meant staying alone. "Equal partners," she repeated, testing the shape of the words, finding she liked them. "I think my grandfather would have liked that arrangement." "Then let's make it official," Dax said, and for the first time since the collapse had taken everything from her, Lyra let herself believe the story wasn't ending in loss at all, but beginning, finally, in something she'd never expected to find again.